I'm going to need you to stop scrolling there, my friend. We got to talk about IEEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act of 1977. I need you to understand this. This case that is percolating right now in the federal appellate circuit is perhaps the most important legal case of your lifetime, certainly the most important in my lifetime, and I'm 40 years old. Now, we have to get some context, and I think looking back a little bit will help us better understand what's happening. But what we are really talking about are the tariffs that were put in place. I think it was April 2nd, calling it Liberation Day in America, where we essentially declared a national emergency and put tariffs in place across the entire world. This is what we're talking about. Now, to understand IEEPA, you have to look back at the Trading with the Enemies Act that happened during the World War I era. In a nutshell, the federal government, the executive branch, has taken on enormous power over the last couple hundred years. The ability to declare emergencies and react to emergencies is something we do want the executive branch to have. If there's a hurricane or an earthquake, or God forbid, a natural disaster with a global war going on, yes, you want the executive to have those powers. But what happens when they become politicized? This was always the question that we had, the tension between what we think of as separation of powers. Now, I've spoken a lot about IEEPA. In fact, I've written about IEEPA. In the notes here, you'll find a link to that article in FreightWaves. But here's what happens in a nutshell. IEEPA was done in 1977, and it gave the president the ability to say, this is a national emergency and I need to use emergency powers. If Congress, who essentially delegated that power of economic tariffs and trade agreements, if they delegated this and they don't like the emergency, they can, under IEEPA, say, look, we're going to vote, the Congress, the House and the Senate, with a simple majority, and say it's not an emergency anymore. Well, if the president disagrees with that, they can simply kind of veto it, and now it goes back to Congress. And when it goes back to Congress, if you truly want to overturn that emergency declaration, you need to have 2/3 majority. In essence, it's all but impossible in our day and age. And so it is super important for you to understand what is actually happening. Just a couple of days ago, maybe a week and a half ago, a federal district court looked at IEEPA and they said the president's use of the emergency declaration and assessing tariffs across the entire trading ecosystem of the United States was not a valid use of that statute, and they stopped every single tariff that was put in place because of that emergency declaration. Well, it didn't take long. It was immediately appealed, and within mere hours after that appeal, the federal appellate court put in a stay. They told the district court, they told the world, these tariffs will remain in place until we have a chance to look at them, rule, and decide de novo. They're looking at this with fresh eyes. They don't need to defer to the lower court at all in the interpretation of IEEPA. Now, what happens next is going to be fascinating. Just yesterday, June 9th, 2025, a group of 33 senators filed an amicus brief that's a friend of the court. They basically came in and said, we have some issues with the administration's use of IEEPA. In a nutshell, they said IEEPA is not a tariff statute. It's not a statute that was designed to give the federal government and give the executive branch the power to do tariffs the way that they have. They say it's a separation of powers issue. Oh, my friends, separation of powers is something that I find deeply important. I think many of you do as well, even if you don't quite understand it. Think of our government as a three-legged table: the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. Each one has checks and balances over the others, and ultimately this is what decides how our government works. But over the last few years, we've seen the growth of the executive branch. And I'm not questioning whether or not the executive branch should or should not grow the way that it has. I want you simply to understand what has happened. Your understanding is the part that I find the most interesting. Now, any day, this order that we have here in the Federal Circuit Court, Federal Appellate Court, when they look at this issue, we will have a ruling. Whether they keep the tariffs in place, whether they remove the tariffs, it honestly doesn't matter, because it will absolutely go to the Supreme Court of the United States. And if we look at what SCOTUS does historically, our court is pretty easy to understand where they're going to go. It's likely 5-4, maybe even 6-3, that the tariffs remain in place. You will see enormous amounts of media over the next couple of days and weeks, maybe even months, as we try to make sense of what has happened. But here is what has happened. This is the critical part that you need to understand. In 1977, we created a statute called IEEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. That statute allows the executive branch to declare an emergency. And when they declare an emergency, enormous power flows to them. And the checks and balances are but fig leaves trying to show you there is some sort of way to stop it. We live in a hyper-politicized environment. People identify party first and a branch or state second. It's just not the way that it was 200 some odd years ago. And if you find this uncomfortable, that's probably the right way to think about it. We may like the outcome, but does the ends justify the means? I don't know. That's not for me to decide. But it is vitally important for you to understand how this works. And how this works is the president has the power to declare an emergency. And if this goes all the way to the Supreme Court and these tariffs are upheld, that means that they can do essentially unilateral trade negotiation without the advice and consent of our Congress. Whether that's good or bad is up to you to decide. But what is very important and what is super critical to remember is these powers do not leave the White House when the person in office leaves. Power is like gravity. It's like an accretion disk when a planet or a star is forming. The matter continues to coalesce. And at the end of the day, that power remains. So the next person in office will inherit that power. Whether you agree with them politically or you do not agree with them politically, the power remains. And so we will be watching this case. I will be watching this case. You should understand it. You need to understand it. This is your democracy. Whether you like it or not, this is what we have to work with. Your understanding is not required. The trends and forces work outside of you, but if you understand them, at least you will have some ability to impact the results. Follow this case, follow our journey. So much more to talk about. Freight never stops, and neither does the law.